Okay. So I did a little bit of digging, and frankly, I don't know why that line of code isn't working. According to everything that I read on MSDN, it should be working. So we're going to go about doing it the hard way, which is just putting a few lines of code in there to make it work. It's not a big deal. So we will actually need to do an update. So we'll say update list, or update student list. So we'll create a method for that. Just for point of reference, again, this is the form main. We're underneath the add button, add student, click button event. So we'll create a new method called update student list. I'm going to use the shortcut to generate the method stub. So we're going to have to do a few things in here. We'll have to delete the current list's contents, the items. We'll need to loop through the students and add them to the list as items. Pretty straightforward. To clear the list or to delete the items, we just reference the list itself. So lst students dot items dot clear. That'll remove all the items from the list. And then to loop, we can just do a basic for loop, or we can do a for each. So let's do a for each in this case. So we can do for each student s in students and then to add the student to the list, we do lst students dot items dot add, and we would just add the s, the student object, to the list box. So if we run it now, we click add student and save. It says the items cannot be modified when the data source property is set. So if we go back to the code, if you stop what you're doing, you'll want to go back into this FRM main load where we added this original line of students and data source, and we'll just want to delete that out. So we run again. Add student. And there's our student. Now, I didn't overload the toString method on the student object, so it's giving me back the namespace and class name of the student. So to get the actual name, we'll go in and modify the student.cs file. And at the bottom, we'll override toString. And then we want it to not return base.toString, because that's what it was doing originally, and it just gave us the class name back. We would want to return first name space last name. Give us the actual student name back. Okay, so if we run it again, we'll add. Alright, something's interesting is going on here. So I put a breakpoint on toString so I can see what that actually resolves out to. So if I say add student, save, it says first name is null and last name is null. Which we have objects in here, there's list items, but there's no text. Oh, okay. Does anybody see the obvious reason? What was that?
You don't need to be string values.
Right. So back on for main, I'm calling this constructor, passing in these strings. But then the actual constructor itself, I'm taking in the strings and I'm not doing anything with them. So both answers essentially are correct. So to fix that, and let me show you, just so you can get a really good understanding of what's happening here. I just need something to put a breakpoint on. So I'm going to run it one more time. So if we add student, we click save. What happened was this line of code, or this segment of code got run. So I basically called new student with a constructor, giving it all of these strings for each parameter. When we get into the body of this, assuming that this line of code wasn't there, we have in these parameters a first name value, a last name value, an address, city, state. And if I jump into my watch 1 at the bottom, I'll put in here first name, okay, well, either way, we're not implementing the method. I'm a little befuddled by that error. So, since I'm not implementing the constructor, I'm not actually setting my properties. So if I do first name equals first name, taking this parameter and actually setting my first name property to it, last name equals last name, address equals address, city equals city, state equals state, zip code equals zip code, email equals email, that one should, yep, and school equals school. Now email is failing because the email property is actually a mail address class, it's not a string. So we'll have to wrap that inside of, if you do new mail address, it takes in a string, so we'll go ahead and just do it like that to account for the casting difference. We'll add phone number. So if we go ahead and run it now, we have a first name and a last name, bonus. So then there's the student. If I click add student and hit save again, I should end up with 2. So basically every time we click add student and save, it adds another copy of that student. So the basic mechanics are there to add a student to the list. So really, to get this functional, what we need to do is we need to implement the student information form so that we can actually add students at will. So to do that, and I'm just going to kind of go through and build it, so you're welcome to follow along with me. I'm just going to drag boxes onto the form, or you can go off on your own and build it, and we'll meet back on the other side once you have your form built. But what we need to do is add a text box for first name, last name, address, city, state, zip code, home, phone, and email. We'll need to add a drop down for the school, add buttons for add, delete, and edit contact, a list box for listing the contacts of that student, and then we'll need that save and cancel button at the bottom of the form. So I'm going to go through and build it. You're welcome to follow along. I'm just going to kind of drag on forms, drop them, maybe talk about it for a little bit as I go through. So one of the nice little tricks is that as you're adding controls to your form, instead of dragging them out individually, you can just double click on the control in the toolbox and it'll just drop one on your form for you. So I just clicked through as I was listing them in my head which text boxes I needed. I'm going to lasso them together, and I need to just lay them out. So I'm going to align them to the left using the alignment tool at the top, and they're all kind of bunched up on one another. So I can then go ahead and use the increase vertical spacing, decrease, or remove, and I think there might even be one here that will, and we can just increase the vertical spacing. So that'll basically give us an alignment of all those boxes. Pretty straightforward. And then with the labels, we can just drop labels. I'll increase the spacing a little bit more. Okay. So each one of these boxes will be my input fields. And then on the second half of the screen, the way that I was considering is that we would have a list box that would act as the contacts. And then we can just have some short buttons to add, edit, and delete. First name, last name, address, city, state, zip.
And from those, it would launch another form.
What was that?
And from that button up there, it would launch another form.
Yes, exactly. So from there, we'll launch the contacts form, and then we'll add contacts to that mini list. So actually, to do one better, we can add a group box here. Let me move him out of the way for a minute. I'm going to grab and lasso these controls. Cut, paste, I've actually just lost my group box. So a little trick you can do if you ever end up losing a control or you can't quite find it or grab it. If you pull up your properties dialog, at the very top you have that drop down, and the drop down lists every control on your form. So in this case, I lost the handle for my group box. So if I click on it, it'll actually give me the group box. It'll grab it for me and give me focus on that control. I can then grab it, put it where I want, resize it the way I need, and then eventually get the contents back that I lost. So there's my list box that I put inside, and I had 3 buttons. So, and then you can use the location property of those controls. So like, for example, this one is like way up here. It's at negative 122 pixels. I can set it to 0. It'll come back to me. Zero, it comes back. Button 1 is this one. Button 2 is at 0. Bring it back. So those are little tricks. If you lose your controls, you can just use those location and that drop down in the properties to grab them and bring them back into focus. So we'll have an add contact, edit contact, delete contact. Okay. Now, unless you have a label that you're actually going to interact with in some way, I've never found it necessary to give your label special names. Text they may need, just so that it actually projects or displays that way. But in terms of giving them names, like these by default are called label 1, label 2, label 3, label 4. If you're not going to interact with them in the code, meaning that you need to know what they're named, I wouldn't worry about naming them, because you're really just going to waste your time giving them names and then never use them. So... few things that I did to my form that maybe weren't so noticeable. If you take focus of the student info box form itself, some of the properties that may be of interest is things like locked, which locked basically says, can the user interact with this form, move it, resize it, things like that. So I set lock to true, which basically locks the form. The user can't move it and do things like that with it. It locks the size and the perspective. Along with that, I set maximize box and minimize box to false. So what does that do? That removes the min and max and restore buttons from the form itself. So basically it shows up with only an X in the corner. So again, it kind of just implies that this is a dialog box. It's not a form, so it only has a limited set of functionality. I guess I missed labeling that. Cancel. The cancel button, I set the dialog result to cancel. So that way when it's clicked, it sends that dialog result back of cancel. With save, I'm actually going to remove the dialog result option of OK. And you'll see why, and then you'll see how we can then set that dialog result later in code once we make our way through. And the reason for that is if we have some sort of validation that we need to do underneath the save button, such as making sure that the email address is really an email address, we may check it, we may deem it not an email address, and then we need to tell the user, hey, you don't have a valid email address, go back and fix it. Well, if we leave the dialog result defaulted to OK, we can show a message box, and then the moment that message box disappears or they hit OK to dismiss it, it'll then send the dialog result of OK back to the main form, and then it'll go ahead and execute without us realizing it or being able to stop it. So having a little bit of control over when that dialog result is set is kind of key to this scenario. Bless you. Thank you. So as we go through, we have first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, home, phone, email, and school as a combo box. So as always, there's a few things that we need to consider before we move into coding too much. So let me slide open my Solution Explorer. Let me jump into my code view. And a couple of things that we need to do is we need to start out by implementing the load student. So that actually takes the information from the student object and populates the form for the first time if we're doing an edit. So let's go through and we'll build that out. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just going to be text box equals property value, text box equals property value, and so forth. Something that we could do here, well, I won't get too complicated. We could do some validation, make sure that we're getting a student in and things like that, but just to keep it simple. So we can do txt firstname.text equals student.firstname, txt lastname.text equals student.lastname. There's a really big pattern going on here, so I'm going to copy this segment of code. I'm going to go txt address, paste, student.address, txt city, paste, student.city. And if you don't know, Control X, Control C, and Control V, cut, copy, paste, so you don't have to reach for the mouse. Txt state, Control V, equals state. Txt zip code, Control V, zip code. Txt hphone, paste, equals home phone. Txt email, paste, is email. And then since this is an email or mail address object, we then have to grab the address property off of the email or the mail address class. And then I don't think I gave it a name, so we'll go back to the combo box and give it a name. CBO school, which will be CBO school And then selected value will equal to student.school.id. And then we'll say load contacts. So again, this is just a basic utility class to help us access our collection, our list of schools. And in this implementation, we're just going to hard code this, but in the future, we can access a text file that has a list. We could access a database, web services. I mean, there's a lot of options there in terms of how you get this, XML documents, all kinds of different potential ways to access this data. So with this school utility, we can go in now back to FRM student info, and we can call from the school utility get schools. So we now have a consistent way of accessing all of these schools. So from anywhere in our code, we can say school utility.get schools, and it will give us that collection of schools. Okay, is everybody good if we go on? Sure. All right. So if we go back to form student info, I'm going to collapse all of these. So
Sorry, what was the after the for each and then add contacts? What was
there is nothing after the for each. That's it. Good? Okay. So when this form loads, what I want to do then is I want to set up or pre-populate the combo box. So if we go back to the design view, click on the form itself, pull up the properties dialog, events, double click on the load event, gives us our event handler stub. I then want to say here, CBO school, normally I'd say we say data source equals school utility, and it lives underneath its own namespace, week 5, app.utilities. Get schools. That should be everything we need to do. I'm going to run it real quick to try. I don't trust it since it didn't work with the other one. Huh, of course, it worked that time. See? So that gives us our drop down of schools then. So at this point, we've created the form. We can type into it. Done no validation, but the form is there. We can hit save. It's going to execute the old segment of code. I did take the OK off, so you're right, so it won't close. So without the dialog result, it's not going to close the form. There's going to be a little bit more time going through this and getting it in place. Do you guys want to take another break, or do you want to keep going? You want to keep going? Okay. All right. Just trying to meet your needs. All right. So moving forward with it, so we need to implement the save button. So double click on save. It gives us our event handler. Inside of save, we basically need to do 3 things. We need to validate fields. We need to collect any changes. we need to return a dialog result. So the simple one is the returning of the dialog result. So assuming that we don't get stopped during the other two steps, we want to say this, and this refers to the form, dot dialog result equals dialog result OK. So we set a dialog result, the method exits, it sends the result back, the form closes, and we go on our merry way through the code we wrote before. If for some reason we don't make it here, that means that we broke out of this event handler and we probably threw out a message box or something. So to validate the fields, we're going to want to do this within try-catch blocks. And that's because if we end up validating against something that doesn't exist, we want to make sure that we don't crash the whole application while doing it. Now we could go through and we could verify that each text box has a value in it, and in a perfect world we should do that. Because I don't want you guys to sit here for another hour, I'm not going to do that. So the only one that I want to validate is mail address. So mail address is not, there's no using statement, so I'm going to bring in the using statement for mail address. It really depends on what you're trying to do and the importance of the validation. Ideally, it's really up to case by case. Ideally, you'd probably want to put them in separate ones. But if you can put them all inside of one, and if one throws an error and it doesn't blow up the entire flow of your application, you're okay with that. Then you can do them all in one. But if one blows up but you still want to keep moving forward, then you'd probably want to loop through or continue through until you got to the end to say, okay, you have issues with these fields, you need to fix them all. And you want to do a try-catch for each one so that you can continue to check all of those fields before you give them a message back. Otherwise, you get stuck on one of those forms where you update one field, you hit the submit button, and then it goes, oh, wait, you got to update this one. You update the next one, you hit the submit button, so you don't want to get your user stuck in that kind of a loop. So we'll say this is test address equals new mail address, and we'll take txt email.text Now this isn't probably the best way to do it. Ideally, if you're going to do some validation, you probably want to do validation where you're using if statements versus try-catch statements. I don't know of a better way to validate an email address besides doing it this way, except for using regular expressions. So I'm not going to bust out a regular expression just to show you what it is if you don't know. If you do know, you understand why I don't want to bust out a regular expression. For those of you who don't know, it's basically this special little mini language that you use to validate strings. It would probably end up looking something like validate an email address. So I don't know if that would actually work, so don't take my word for it, but actually this shouldn't be a digit, it should be a word. D's are numbers, W's are words. Yeah. So anyway. So you would want to go through and validate all your fields. From there, we want to collect those changes. Now, the edit mode is really important here because it's going to determine how we interact with retrieving of this data. If our edit mode is create, then the first thing we want to do is take student and set it equal to a new student. Because in create, we don't have a student currently stored in that variable. In edit, we do. So in create mode, we want to put something there, and then we don't have to duplicate effort as we move forward. So now that we're guaranteed to have a student, we can then do student.firstname equals txt firstname.text, and we get to do this fun dance again. Student.lastname equals txt lastname.text. Student.address equals txt address.text. Okay. I'll let everyone else catch up, and I'm going to talk about something else real quick. I'm not going to explain it all right now. We'll talk about it in future classes, but it's one line of code that makes 10 lines of code disappear. Within C#, starting in version 3.0, Microsoft introduced a concept called a lambda expression. And I think I mentioned this once briefly before. What a lambda expression does is allows for you, and I'm going to use the technical definition and I'll tell you what it really means. It allows for you to write a delegate in shorthand which can perform an action without having to construct full method bodies. So what that basically means is that it's shorthand for you to write a function without actually having to write a function and make it do stuff. Most often you use a lambda expression for basic logic conditions. So if you remember from the other week, we wrote an isMatch function where we were basically passing in, I forget what we were passing in, students, I think. And we were saying, is this student a match? And it would go through and it would do the matches. And it was the schools. Anyway, we wrote that function. And it had to go through and do the logic, the predicate logic for the match. And we had to write a whole new method. We had to call that method. We had to pass it and do all these things. With a lambda expression, it basically turns all of that into one line of code. So I'm going to write out what the full method would look like so you can see the transformation from a method into a lambda expression. So my goal that I want for this line is I want to say student.school equals school from school utility dot get schools. Okay? That's what I want it to do. Now to do that, it's not realistic because in order to get schools, I have to say school utility dot get schools, probably stored in this variable. Let me just comment this line out. And then I have to do a loop. And then I have to do something to the effect of if sch.id equals cbo.school, or I'm sorry, selected value. Then I have to say school selected SEH, and then say selected SEH equals SEH, and then eventually I get to school dot or student.school equals SECH. Or that's right, selected. So I have to write all of that in order to actually get my school for my student. Oh, I need to cast this as an end. instead of doing all of this, I'd like to eliminate the loop. I'd like to minimize the if statement and basically get back one school. So to do this, we're actually going to use a combination of lambda expressions and another thing called link. So I'm going to start out with selecting all my schools, saying get schools. So that returns me a collection. From this collection, I have a series of methods that I can call off of that collection. So think of this as all schools. I can then say find, and it wants a predicate to find the matching school. I can then put in here SCH arrow, and what predicate wants back is a Boolean value. So I can say if sch.id equals CBO school dot selected value, and that serves the exact same purpose. So if we walk through it real quick, just to get a good understanding. So we're calling get schools, it returns all schools. From that collection, we can call find. Find will then do a for each loop through every item in the collection, and it will basically run it against this lambda expression, passing it in as a parameter to SCH. It then does this logic statement, takes the true or false that's returned, and determines if it found it or not. If it found it, it returns the item, and if it doesn't, it returns null. So this one, presumably line of code, replaces all of this work in extra variable declaration. So we can now say, if we bring this back out, can do that one line of code, and that does the same work. All right. So we now have our school. So, at this point, I'm not going to, I actually advise you not to follow along, just so we can get through a little faster, if that's okay with everybody. I'm going to post this. I'm going to post all the videos and everything, so if you want to go back and watch them, you can do that. So one of the last pieces I'm going to do here is in my form load, I need to make a couple of small modifications. So CBO school dot display member equals name. And CBO school dot value member equals ID. So that's that key value, name value pair that I was talking about. We have to declare those so that when it does the binding, it knows which properties to pick up. So name and ID are the properties of the school object. And that's what we're doing, is we're explicitly telling the combo box these are the properties you need to use. So I'm going to go ahead and add a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here just so we can see what's happening. And assuming all things are correct. Not all things are correct. There's one piece I forgot. Alright, so we've got School info done. We'll go back into form main. We're going to get rid of this because we don't need it now. Go ahead and run now. Add student. We'll hit save. So edit mode is create a new student. We will then capture all of these values. The selected value is 1 off the combo box. So we're going to have this lambda expression loop through and find it. It found the high school. Set the property to the school. And then we redo our dialog result of OK. And there's the student. So again, we're in create mode. Cruise through. So the student is Steve. I'm going to drop a breakpoint inside of this lambda expression just so you can get a feel for it. By doing that, I'm clicking, instead of just clicking over here to set the breakpoint, I'm actually going to right click inside of the expression, insert breakpoint. So it actually put a break inside of the expression so you can kind of get a feel for what it's doing. And then I'll put SCH in there, and we'll let the code run. So you can see it's taking all the results from Get Schools, and if you watch down here, you'll see it's high school, junior high, middle school, and it's validating this expression. It's saying, does it equal 5? So it's actually doing that logic. And it finds the last one, returns Oak, sets the dialog result to OK. Now we have both. Okay. We obviously didn't get as far as I wanted. What was that? Right. Well, what I'm thinking is the homework, debating about what to do.